Green. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a little bit of history on the town of Lexington and the Green because it is going to help explain the story later on. Let's move over here. Lexington was originally known as Cambridge Farms. It was the westernmost part of the town of Cambridge. In 1689, it was set up as a separate community. And in 1703, it became a separate town. Back in those days in Massachusetts Bay Colony, to have a separate town, you needed to have a separate church and a congregation. But it had to be a pretty good-sized congregation. And eventually, it did become a congregation of good size, so they were able to set the town off separately. This Lexington Green is pretty much unchanged since those times. This is where the early trained bandit, they call them, after the English militias, over in England obviously, they would meet and they would train here. Where this pulpit is the site of the first meeting house in Lexington. It was built a little after the early 1700s, and it lasted into the 1800s, where it was taken down and replaced by a structure down there. The first minister was a man by the name of John Hancock. You may be familiar with the family. We're going to talk a little bit more about them later on. Not only would he have a grandson that would become very famous, but he would also have a grandson-in-law who would be famous here in Lexington as well. I don't know if you can see it, but that monument there was the site of the old belfry. The belfry was actually a structure that housed a bell, and they would ring it for church services. It would also be rung if you were to call the militia in order. The belfry was originally up that hill. In the early 1770s, they decided to move it to the Green. After the Revolutionary War, they moved it back up the hill where you can still see it today. It had come down in a storm in the early 1900s, and it had been rebuilt, essentially with the original timber, and it's still there today. When we walk back, you may be able to catch a glimpse of it. By the early 1700s, there had been trouble with the colonies and the king and the ministry in London. What had happened was, after years of fighting in England herself and in Great Britain in general over the supremacy of the king or parliament, parliamentary forces had won out. However, something very strange started happening in 1760. The first Hanoverian king, who was born in England, decided that he was going to break with his grandfather, George II, and become a Tory, or favor a Tory. Now, a Tory was a gentleman who favored the divine right of kings and the supremacy of an aristocracy over an elected parliament. That is how he started to rule. That cascaded with a series of events where he knew he couldn't do it himself because this king did not have that kind of power. He ended up buying offices with the emoluments, which the money that the crown had, and bought elections in parliament for the commons. Even more easily, he was able to ennoble men where they would take a seat in the House of Lords, which at that time was the upper chamber. Today it still technically is, but it's really a shadow of its former self. By the early 1770s, George III had 2/3 of both houses of parliament, and he was able to use those decrees to get what he wanted through the Tory party. Certainly a number of acts have been passed, acts that really had not pertained to colonies before. The colonies obviously could not have representation over in the Parliament in London. Technically they could, but effectively their own legislature served as that check. George III wanted to consolidate power in Great Britain, but he knew he had to be careful there because he started to do that, and he didn't want to end up like another king who lost his head trying to do the same thing in the 1640s, Charles I. So he starts here in the colonies, particularly New England, particularly in Massachusetts. Why Massachusetts? Well, Massachusetts was settled by a group of folks known as the Puritans. They were Bible-believing folks, very influential in England in the Civil War, and they won the Civil War, and then later lost control of the country. Puritan and Whig thought, which is the other power from the Tories, the other party from the Tories, Whigs believed in the power of the individual, Parliament over a king, and they believed in actually local types of rule in today's parlance, I would say. So at that point, the center of that in the British Empire was here in Massachusetts. So obviously there was going to be a big clash here with the Stamp Acts, with the tea tax, which also wasn't just the amount of tax, it was the fact that tax was being levied. And what were they doing with that money? They were paying colonial officials instead of having the colonial officials themselves get paid by their own assembly. So now who are those colonial officials going to answer to? We see that to this day, right? Where do some of these public officials answer to? They answer to somebody other than we the people, and that was a big issue. The other problem they had was the fact that in punishment of what King George considered egregious acts, which he had no constitution now. There was a constitution, still is in England. It's unwritten, but it's a series of documents that are put together. And he actually had Parliament pass a rule that outlawed town meeting in Massachusetts. And he closed the port of Boston. Boston was one of the largest cities in the colonies and in the British Empire itself. It was pretty sizable. So that means people couldn't fish, they couldn't earn a living, and it really impinged them greatly. So by 1774, the colony of Massachusetts and the other colonies decide they're going to have to take control of their militias, and that's what they do. And Lexington was no exception. The Minutemen Concept was born, where a certain segment of that militia was segregated and set aside. These were the men who were more veteran. They were the men who could fight a little bit more. They were the ones who could be depended upon more in battle. And then the rest of the militia would fall in. Then you would have an alarm list of older gentlemen. Some of them could still fight. We'll talk about that later. Some towns had a separate minute company. Some towns did not. Lexington did not have a separate minute company, but some companies just used everybody, and they did have minute companies. They just segregated them out. So let's take a little further walk on down. Yes, sir. Oh, I don't know. I don't know. That should be all the way up. That's not half mast, so I don't know what they're doing. That's the town of Lexington. Okay, we'll stop here, folks. I just want to explain the militia system here, or the train band system here in Lexington. In every one of these towns, the most important individual was the town minister. The town minister here was a man named Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark married a granddaughter of John Hancock. And within a few years of an absence of a minister, he actually succeeded the man whose granddaughter he married. John Hancock since passed away. He was also a Whig, very much involved in the affairs in Boston and in Massachusetts. Some of the early patriots of the day. Samuel Adams was the most prominent. Another man by the name of John Hancock, who was the grandson of John Hancock, is another. And he spent some of his youth here with his grandfather. Another one was a man by the name of James Otis. He was the son of James Otis the first, very powerful man in the colonies, Attorney General of Massachusetts for a while, and he followed in his father's footsteps. And he spoke early against the writs of the king in Boston. John Adams, second cousin of Samuel Adams, another man who they shared a great-grandfather, who became very prominent later on. Paul Revere, who we'll see later on that day. Joseph Warren, who will be here later on that day. William Dawes, maybe not as prominent high up, but still played a role that day. So, what happened was, things were coming to a head. Port of Boston Bill, and then the Governor of Massachusetts Act. Not only could you not have town meeting, but now the governor was going to be the same man who was the commander-in-chief of the British forces, who was William Gage. So now, you have a general who's effectively, not effectively, is the military governor of Massachusetts. Just imagine the effect it has on the people. One thing it doesn't control, the state or the colonial assembly or the provincial assembly and the militias, because they're all under weak control. The capital moved a couple of places. They moved it back to Salem for a while. Then finally they dissolved the assembly and reconstituted it in Concord. And that is where the de facto capital of Massachusetts is on April 18th, 1775. Something else that is there as well are the cannons and also the armaments, powder, bullets, cartridges, all kinds of supplies that would be needed to fight a war. That is what was down in Concord, and there's the word to Concord there. So, what did they do? Well, the Secretary of State, Lord Dartmouth, is ordered to send an order to all the colonial governors here and the military heads as well to seize all the powder in the colonies. Right now, at this point, Continental Congress is about to meet, the Second Continental Congress. There was the first that met in the early 1770s. The second one's about to meet. All the prominent men in Massachusetts are heading down that way, or the five most prominent are. Joseph Warren is left in charge as the next man in line. He gets a hold of the orders. The other thing that had happened is there were always standing orders to have two men arrested, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Not the primary goal of the forces, but one of the goals of the forces, if they could find him. So he dispatched one of his partners, another man who had been kind of left in charge, a man named Paul Revere. Paul Revere did more than just ride by himself. He organized the entire alarm system in Massachusetts, went throughout all of New England, and carried itself all the way down to Georgia. Paul Revere organized on many occasions, and he had an alarm system ready to go on April 18th. And he eventually takes advantage of it and goes himself and does it. So, on April 18th, Revere's dispatched, comes down, rides. Initially what he does is he's sending other riders out, but he decides he better come down himself to make sure everything's in order and to make sure that Adams and Hancock get the word. Warren asked if he could do that, and he said he could. Meanwhile, Dr. Warren dispatches another man by the name of William Dawes, whose sole purpose was to make sure Adams and Hancock had the warning. That was his sole job. He rides in a different way, basically through what was called Boston Neck, present-day Washington Street, for those familiar with Boston. Paul Revere actually rode across the channel. Back then it was a much larger channel, and he ends up in what is now the other part of Cambridge, and then rides from there into Somerville, and then comes all the way this way, alarming the different militias. So the different militia systems get alarmed. Well, somewhere about 1 o'clock, after he comes through, he warns Adams and Hancock. Dawes shows up, and that house is still there to this day, down the Bedford Road. It's a parsonage, the Hancock Clark House, and Adams and Hancock were staying in there. Obviously, Hancock's sister's married to Clark, but they're good friends, and that's where they were staying for safekeeping. Eventually, what happens is the militia here is called out, or the train band is called out. They had a minute company down there, or a minute group down there. The rest of the militia is called out here, and what happened was there was about 130 men altogether. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, they're out here, and they're all consulting. You have Paul Revere's out here, even Dawes is out here, Jonas Clark is out here, and the man who's in charge, a man by the name of John Parker, is actually the man who was elected to command the group that day. They had two things they were going to do. One, they were going to make sure that any Crown forces, ministerial forces, or redcoats that came down were going to get the message that they weren't going to get the powder. They didn't have the right to seize it, they weren't going to seize it. The other thing they were going to be sure of is they weren't going to fire first. Very important to remember, because the debates, who did what, who started what, keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about what really happened here that's going to unfold in front of your eyes as to why things transpired the way they did. stop right here, folks, for the moment. After they mustered, Captain Parker sent out a couple of riders to find out if they could probe and find out where that British column was. Who was this British column? General Gage had orders to seize the powder in Concord. He sent out a force, 2 portions. First portion, roughly 600 men, 700 men, under a man by the name of Smith. He was a lieutenant colonel, battle experience, maybe not in the prime of his life, but he's, he supposedly knows what he's doing. Along with him is a battalion of Marines, led by the effective second in command of this column, man by the name of John Pitcairn. And Pitcairn is the ranking British Marine officer in North America. Give you an idea of his status. Back in those days, the Marine ranks did not go very high in any Marine force. Behind them was going to be a relief force of another 700 to 800 men. That would be led by a man named Hugh Smithson Jr., whose father had been ennobled as Lord Percy. He had married into the Percy family. He took the name, was allowed to carry on. If anybody knows their Shakespeare, the Percy family and Shakespeare, that's the same family. Really? And Hugh Smithson himself is styled Lord Percy. His father, ironically, is an opponent of the Crown policy in North America, and he's also an opponent of the war later on. But Percy's looking for advancement, so he comes here. He's a brigadier general. He's a young man. He's in his early 30s, but he's a pretty good officer. But he hasn't seen battle yet. He would have been too young for the last war. So, about 3 o'clock in the morning, a couple of the riders that were dispatched come back to Captain Parker. They don't see anyone. Parker confers with his men and decides, okay, instead of just sitting here waiting all night and having everybody exhausted, we're going to disperse and then just be ready to ride in the sound of the guns the next morning, or to walk in the sound of the alarm. The men who lived on the further part of town decided to stay there in the Buckman Tavern, which was a stop along the way to the road to Boston, obviously, a very well-known place that had been around almost since the town of Lexington itself. Those men went in there to sleep, maybe get something to eat. I assure you, they were not drinking copious amounts of alcohol. Not on that night, maybe not any other night. You're talking about basically godly Puritan New England. They really didn't do what people do today. So that's where they were. Eventually, Adams and Hancock are set on their way because Hancock wants to come out here with a militia. That's what he does. He wants to come out here and he wants to fight because as a young boy, after his father, another minister, had passed away in what is now Quincy, well, North Braintree, he felt a kinship with the town and he felt, we should be out here. Sam Adams and his family who were with him convinced him that he needed to go. Adams said, our job is with the government. We can't be out here. We're not going to help anybody out here right now. So they're on their way to Philadelphia. Meanwhile, Paul Revere, William Dawes, had another mishap along their way. When they went to warn the town of Concord, they ran into a man by the name of Samuel Prescott, who was dating a woman named Lydia Mulligan, who lived in Lexington. Now, Prescott himself was from Concord, and he asked if he could fall in. They kind of recognized who he was. He was a true-born son of liberty, so the three of them ride. Who do they ride? Well, they go into what is now, well, it was Lincoln back then, too, town of Lincoln, and they're stopped by a British patrol. Early that morning, or should I say later the previous evening, Gage had sent out a patrol led by a man by the name of Major Mitchell. 25, 26-year-old Irish officer, hot-tempered, hates Americans. So it gives you an idea of what you're going to expect. That night, when he's in the town of Lincoln, the alarm has already been given out and these men are nervous. One of the men from Lincoln walks up to him, who's an alarm writer. He says, "Are the regulars out?" They said, "I'll show you where the regulars are," and he takes a saber and he slashes the man over his head. Well, doesn't kill him. We believe it was probably Mitchell because he said it was the commanding officer who did that to him, a man named Josiah Nelson. He went to inform his neighbors with a bleeding head and said, "Hey, have you seen the regulars?" He says, "Yeah, they're the ones that tried to scalp me." That's the party those three men run into, Revere, Prescott, and Dawes. All three men are captured. As they're being led away, they all break for an escape. They all escape momentarily, except the patrol catches up to Revere first, surrounds him. Dawes is almost captured, but his horse throws him, so he hides in the bushes and he pretends there's a militia group behind him. He scares away the party. Prescott spurs his horse over a hedge, the only man to get away. Later on that night, Prescott and Dawes make their way back to Lexington. They report what has happened. Well, Parker stays out here all night with some of his men, Sergeant Monroe being one of them. A couple others. You know, they have a lieutenant, they have a sergeant. And all of a sudden, just before 5 o'clock in the morning, an alarm rider comes in. He discovered the patrol. There are a few things he tells Parker, because Parker's over there at this point. One, he discovered the patrol, and it's the patrol that's coming out to get the guns. Two, there's about 600 of them. And three, they're less than 15 minutes away. Imagine getting that news. Half his men are there, the other half are around. He sends his men up to ring the bell through. It rings. Incredibly enough, most of the 130 men try to make their way back. Only 45 of them are here, initially. Another 40 are around the green trying to make their way to the green. Huge confusion. Then you look at the British side of the ledger. Oh yeah, I told you they were led by a Marine. Well, Pitcairn and Smith put Pitcairn's lieutenant, Jesse Adair, in charge of the first 300 men, including Army troops, who he's never led before. Adair's even younger than Mitchell. Irishman, never led men in battle. He has the first 300 men of the column. Their orders are to go to Concord to get the powder. I told you about the meeting house, right? Well, Parker has his men lined up here. Adair comes. Guess which way he decides he wants to break? He takes 300 men, and now he's facing somewhere around 50 of Parker's men. They can't go any further. All of a sudden, Pitcairn and Smith are wondering what happened to their column. They should be going that way. They don't see anybody there. They see him coming here. One of the men with Lieutenant Adair is a lieutenant by the name of Sutherland, a Scotsman, another one. Scotsman's another young, early 20s guy. Never seen battle before, not even supposed to be in that column. He stowed away that morning and he attached himself to the column, so by the time they got out, they said, "What are you doing here?" "Well, I figured I'd attach myself since your other officer didn't make it." By the way, some of the men didn't even get the orders right away because somebody fell asleep and didn't get orders to the rest of the column until much later. He's there with Adair. Mitchell joins them because they join right at the top. Between the three of them, they say, "We're going to take these so-and-sos out," essentially. So they come down. Parker has the orders. They order Parker and his men to surrender. They don't do it, and they're not going to do it. Parker knows that he has 50, maybe 60 men, and maybe 20 more coming on, 25 more coming on the green. His other men, even at 130, aren't going to take on 600, but they're not going to give the ground. So what happens? As soon as Smith and Pitcairn start riding on, Pitcairn gets here first. Smith is on his way. They're wondering what's going on. The only mounted men that day are the British officers. The British rank and file and the Americans here in Lexington do not have horses. The officers on horseback have pistol, and that's going to be key. In the middle of this melee, Parker says he sees the other 300 or so men coming in. He orders his men to disperse. Now understand what that means. Disperse doesn't mean I'm going to surrender, or we made a big mistake, or we can't handle this. Disperse means you men are going to go from here, back there, and reform, and see what they're going to do at that point. So he wheels his men around, they disperse. At this point, they're in individual order, meaning that they're going off on their own to disperse later. At that point, the British officers on horseback are scoring up a storm. At that moment, 2 shots ring out. The only thing that's agreed between the witnesses on either side is that they were pistol shots. One of the depositions, or 2 from the British and a couple from the Americans, say a pistol shot went off. More than likely. The culprit likely, Major Mitchell and Major Sutherland. Sutherland, he couldn't manage his horse because that wasn't his horse. And Mitchell already had his blood up that day, and these men were leaving. They didn't want to see him go. That's probably what happened. More than likely. As soon as those shots rang out, the British rank and file took that as the order to fire. They fired on these men with their backs turned mostly. There were only 2 men that turned around to fire back, 2 or 3 that turned around to fire back. One of them was killed here. Before long, one of the prisoners that was loose came out of Woburn. There were some prisoners they had taken earlier. He tries to escape, they shoot him in the back. Another 6 Lexington Minutemen working their way there are shot in the back. Another 8 are wounded. And that's the marker that marks the spot where Parker had his men line up. One of the men, a man by the name of Jonathan Harrington, lived in that house. One of the men shot in the back. The one thing he was able to manage to do was crawl to that doorstep. It's still there. You see the granite? You see the stairs. And he managed to die as his wife and his son came out of the house. At this point, the rest of Parker's men dispersed. They're behind that house, behind near the swamp area. Pitcairn and Smith desperately try to get their men into order. Smith finally finds a drummer, he's experienced enough, beats him to order. And then they let out with that loud, throaty cheer, huzzah, huzzah, huzzah! And then they march on to Concord. I'm going to walk slowly. You don't have to.
I got a cramp, that's all.
Okay. Now in Concord, it's interesting because they're on their way to Concord, and of course what's in Concord? The munitions, right? So they saw they had a dust up here. They figured they could take any militia there was. They didn't even stop to think that they had shot these men in the back. They vastly outnumbered them. One British soldier is wounded. Pitcairn has a bloody finger. We figure he may have been nicked here. And one of the horses for one of the officers was nicked. That's what we can tell for damage. For them. For casualties, if you call them that. They go into Concord. Now, they know that your countryside has been alarmed. So they march into Concord. They're looking for the stores. They can't find them. They've been hidden. Their spies told them where they think they could find them. They could not find them. Well, they go to a bridge north end of town called the Old North Bridge. You may have heard of it. And Smith pulls his columns out. He ends up leaving about 100 of them behind the river. They're fighting to catch up. Before he leaves town, they did manage to get a couple of pieces of ordnance, wooden carriages that the guns would sit on, and they start to burn them. At the top of the hill overlooking the bridge, you can see it today, although there's some trees in the way. The men weren't sure what was happening. At this point, men from all over Middlesex County nearby were gathering at the top of that hill, 400 of them, led by Colonel Barrett and Major Buttrick, whose house had housed some of that ordnance. other, are we going to let them burn the town down? So they decided to march down. As they were marching, the 100 British detachment was caught behind, started rushing to the bridge. They look up there, they know they're outnumbered. They saw what happened in Lexington, they're getting out. However, they try to take the planks off the bridge. They're ordered not to do that. Meanwhile, the men come marching down, led by Acton. They have bayonets. Their Captain Isaac Davis to train them in the use of bayonets. Keeping in mind that day, I told you that those British officers didn't have a lot of experience, the older ones did. The British rank and file didn't either. Their age group would not have allowed them to have huge battle experience. The NCOs would have. On the American side, actually, a good percentage of them did have battle experience. They fought in the colonial wars. Some of them actually fought in the British Army ranks for a time. Actually, some NCOs who either retired or deserted were helping to train some of the troops too. That's another interesting story. But they had more battle experience on the American side than on the British side. That's something that's very distorted to this day, but you want to keep that in mind, because that helps explain what is going on. And they're very well trained, and they've been well trained for the last year. They get to the bridge, and again, they're ordered not to fire first. To give you an idea why we know this, as they approach the bridge, scattershot comes from the British side of the river at that point. Isaac Davis and one of his men is instantly killed. At that point, Buttrick has to order them into fire, because they're not, they're ready to. He said, "Fire, for God's sake, fire!" They fire, kill 3 British soldiers, and they wound another 10, including 4 officers. They beat a heavy retreat. They get to the other side of the Concord area, a place called Merriam Farm, where the rest of the British detachment is. At this point, both sides are eyeing each other. The American forces at this point, provincials, probably 600-700 men. They probably equal in size to the British column man-wise, and more men are coming in. So neither side wants to generally engage yet, because everybody's taken by surprise. Is there a fight? That doesn't surprise them, but it wasn't supposed to necessarily be that day. One of the reasons the Americans hesitated was because they weren't sure if the British carried live ammunition. Back in those days, it was called firing ball, the actual bullet projectile in the cartridge. One of the things that the Concord men heard about, and the men with them, that there was firing in Lexington, but they weren't sure. They had heard some men had been shot. They weren't sure if they were shot or they were just firing blanks. They didn't know. Are they firing ball? Well, when they saw those 2 men drop, they knew they were firing ball. So both sides are trying to avoid a general engagement until they can both organize themselves. At one point in time, for the 3rd time, 2 British rear guard, which are the people at the end of the column, turn around and fire at 2 of the Patriots on the hill. The Patriots return fire. The battle's in general earnest, and this time the British are getting pushed. They beat a pell-mell retreat out of Concord. They're still in good order, though. And they have the provincial militias from all the areas, and the Minutemen from the other areas closing in on them. But they do have some better armament, but they're being chased down the road. So they figure at some point in time they can turn around, make a stand, and drive off the militia. Now remember, the British forces had to go to Lexington to get to Concord. Guess which way they have to come back? All right? Parker lost 7 men, actually. One of them was not a Lexington man, he was a Woburn man, brave man, but not one of the Lexington company. He had 10 wounded, all of them could fight. So he basically has 123 men that they decide to station up on that road coming back, just inside the line. That area is called Parker's Revenge, and I'm going to explain why they call it that in a minute. Well, Parker's men are very angry, obviously. Jonas Clark, the minister, had come out, saw what had happened, everybody's outraged. What do we do now? Because they don't have direct orders. Well, we're going to set up inside town. We're going to await the other American column, because they all work under the command of Colonel Major Buttrick and the colonel I mentioned before, Colonel Barrett. Well, as soon as they get there, they line up on both sides of the road, some of them in the road. They didn't all hide behind hedges. We'll talk about that in a minute. They noticed the dust up in front of them. It's the British column coming back toward Lexington. And then they see their fellow, trained band soldiers, militia, Minutemen soldiers in the background chasing them, but the British are still in good order. As soon as they cross the Lexington line on both sides, bang, 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 bang. The British column takes its most withering fire of the day. Major Pitcairn is wounded. Colonel Smith is wounded. Lieutenant Sutherland is wounded. They had a few more officers get killed. And they're in a general panic at this point. They're fighting it on. This time Parker's 120-something men are now fighting the 300-some-odd vanguard that is there and fighting them pretty hard. At some point, they have to retreat into the path area, but they still harry the British. Plus their men are behind them. Between that point and this, the British column almost collapses. There are men that are on their knees, panting for water. Men who are wounded. Smith ends up giving his horse to one of his wounded guys because he can't make it anymore. He's leading him along. Some people said, well, he did that so he didn't get shot. I don't think that's what he was doing. I think he meant doing that. The rest of his action's different, but that action that day, no. These guys weren't cowards. So they're leading these men back. All of a sudden, it looks like the column's about to surrender. They hear a boom. Cannonball goes through the meeting house. It was Lord Percy in the relief column. Lord Percy had been given his orders 3 hours late. The reason he was given the orders late is the go-between him and Gage had fallen asleep. And he had woken up and he discovered he had these orders. Now, one of the things he had is he had cannon. He had a couple of cannon with him, which is great. The problem is he didn't think he needed a lot of ammunition wagons because, hey, these are the militia. We're going to take care of them, no problem. He does manage to rescue the party. He has the party in. He's in charge now. On the other side, a man by the name of General Heath is in charge of the American forces. So now you have two generals on the field. Percy believes, now I have the column, I have the whole, basically, force with me, minus casualties. We're going to make a stand and go back. Well, he discovers to his horror, not only the Lexington men, but the other men from the other surround start harrying his flanks. There's open street fighting. Some of the best British fighting that day was when they had their flanking parties go into the woods. People that say they didn't know how to fight in the woods, that's garbage. The only thing Gage was really good at, he was not a good general himself in the 7 Years' War, but he learned the lesson of the flanking parties fighting here, and he trained, like the Americans, he trained the British flanking parties to be able to go in the woods. Some of the Americans could fight in open order. They were battle hardened, so they had that experience. So you had all kinds of fighting. All of a sudden, Percy discovers he's taking heavy casualties. He has to get back to Boston himself. So he beats a retreat down, unlimbers the cannon a couple of times, fires a couple of shots. Doesn't quite work, and then he finally has to retreat all the way back. In the meantime, they march through. The worst fighting of the day is going to be in a place called Minutemen. We call it Arlington. That was actually West Cambridge. It was still technically part of Cambridge. At that point, the heaviest fighting takes place. Some of the American dead are non-combatants. They thought they were combatants, or they didn't stop to think, and they just shot them dead. 2 men at a bar were in that situation. Some of the men had to go into a house in Arlington. It's there today. And they were cut down by the British when they came in, but they did take a heavy toll on their men. A couple of interesting stories. There was an old alarmless group, older men, led by a mulatto. And his name was David Samuelson. And they had fought in the last war, and they captured a British baggage train. So whatever artillery rounds that Percy had left has now been captured. He has very few pieces left to use. Even more amusing, there was an old lady who was somewhat of an itinerant. I called her Mother Birkedike. She ran into a British grenadier party of about 6 men, 5 or 6 men. They were so exhausted from the fighting that she ended up taking them all prisoner. They just surrendered to her. They didn't want to surrender to the militia. They just surrendered to her. So she supposedly said, you can go back and tell King George that an old lady took 6 of his grenadiers prisoner. Even more incredibly, there was another man by the name of Samuel Whittemore, about 80 years old. Not only was he a veteran of the last war, he was a veteran of the last three. He had been so good that he had actually been in an English Dragoon regiment, a horse regiment, which was fairly an elite unit. His family that morning said, "Oh, you sure you want to go out?" He says, "No, you take care of yourselves. I'm going out. I know how to fight. Some of these guys really could use some help." And he was right. So what does he do? He stumbles across a group of young men who are having a really hard time with the British units. Some of them are grenadiers, some of them are Marines. And the young men take a couple of casualties, they run. He stays where he is. He takes out his musket, kills 3 grenadiers, then takes out his pistol, shoots another, and then about 4 or 5 of them, 6 of them jump on him. They bayonet him, he fights them off, he still wounds them. One of them shoots part of his face off. He probably suffered maybe 10, 15 bayonet wounds, they figured. And they left him to die. Dr. Tufts, the early version of Dr. Tufts, was on the scene, and they called him over. And he said, "Look, there's nothing I can do for this man, he's dying." He eventually dies. He dies probably 18 years later. He survived the fight. And people said, despite his bad wounds, you can never tell he was really badly injured. They said, "How do you feel?" He says, "Oh, I have a slight limp." And you could barely even notice that according to what people were saying. But he killed up to 5, maybe 6 British grenadiers in his escapade there. And there's a monument to him right at that part of Arlington. So, the British have to harry in. They get to Charlestown, and there is a group of Essex militia led by a man named Timothy Pickering. There is miscommunication between Pickering and Heath as to what to do. Pickering didn't know he had orders to cut him off, so he doesn't, but he tries to get down there. He said, "It's understood that you engage him when you find him." Well, Percy's a good officer. He gets away. He gets into Somerville. He's able to escape, ferries his guys over to Charlestown, and they fortify the reverse slope of Bunker's Hill. At that point, the Americans try to enter Charlestown. They get into Charlestown. They can't go any further because the British Navy, is there. However, that's where the battle ended. Roughly Americans dead, were about 49 killed, including 3 non-combatants. One of them was a boy who opened up his shuttered doors in Charlestown. The British officer just turned around, shot him, didn't know who he was probably. Maybe he did, I don't know. Killed him. And 73 British soldiers. It was a very devastating defeat for them. They're shut up in the city of Boston, never to leave it again until George Washington forces them out. Let's go down to the other part of the battle. After the battle, the dead here were collected. Woburn man, Ashabel Porter, was sent back to Woburn. And they were buried right behind what is now the First Parish Church. That was the successor church that was up there. There is a cemetery there. And John Parker's buried there. He dies in the siege of Boston of tuberculosis. Disease, camp disease. I don't believe he had it when he was here. Dead men don't leave companies. That is my cited opinion on the matter, but other people like to say that. But they were all buried back there in the Lexington Memorial. In 1799, they started the commemorations here in Concord. Here, they took the Lexington men who were killed. Robert Monroe from the famous Monroe family here. He was the highest ranking Lexington man to die that day. And the other men here, Jonas Parker, Captain Parker's cousin Samuel Hadley, Jonathan Harrington, Isaac Muzzy, Caleb Harrington, and John Brown. They were all reburied under here. The monument here and the monument at the bridge in Concord are the two oldest monuments in the United States that were put up for our war day. Town of Acton, ironically, did the same thing. They disinterred their 3 men. There was a 3rd man who was killed in addition to Isaac Davis and Abner Hosmer at the bridge. When they got into Lexington, there was another man who was killed. And he actually killed a British soldier who shot him. They had a beat on each other. The British soldiers killed instantly. He dies later. The 3 of them are reinterred in Acton under the Acton, right in the Acton Town Square. Interestingly enough, there's a boulder. That's the spot that Isaac Davis fell on in Concord. For the centennial in 1875, they disinterred the boulder and they put it there. And that's where the statue for the Concord Minuteman is to this day. And that represents Isaac Davis. And that plow was his plow that he left behind before he led his men into battle. And it's in the Acton Town Hall today as an aside. But this is the final resting spot for the men in Lexington who were killed on the green that morning. Any questions before we proceed? Wow, must have covered a lot of ground, huh?
A lot of information.
Literally.
If you want, take your time, take some pictures if you like. We only have 1 or 2 more stops before we finish. That's right. You'll see it between those 2 houses over there. You can look right up and see it. It's there. In fact, you may be able to see it from this vantage. Yeah, there. You see it? Right from that vantage point up on the hill? That is this. This was where they had moved it. Ironically, they moved it here in the early 1770s. The reason I think they did it, because obviously anticipating some of the troubles they had, they probably wanted to have the belfry where they could get to it quickly and alarm the town if there was going to be a problem, like on April 19th. Maybe 10 years after the war ended, they moved it back up to that hill, and it was this, you know, it was damaged in a storm and then rebuilt after.
She was driving a Subaru. Yeah, she's definitely liberal.
She's definitely what?
Liberal.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
This is the famous Minuteman statue.